This boat wasn't the only one to venture out into Lake Huron despite the weather warning, and she wouldn't be the only one to face the storm. As the wind picked up, whipping razor-sharp snowflakes into the faces of the crew and stirring up the Great Lakes, the boat had a chance to save herself. The crew shivered and worked desperately as the waves grew larger and larger. Out into Lake Huron they turned as the decks began to ice over, the wind howled, and the boat was tossed about like it weighed nothing. Suddenly, the sharp gale shifted directions, slamming against the boat in the opposite direction of the waves. To and fro, back and forth, the boat was tossed as they turned out into Lake Huron. The crew's hands were shaking as they desperately tried to manage their boat, and they all wondered the same thing. Would they survive the White Hurricane? On November 9, 1913, the worst storm to ever hit the Great Lakes would wipe out 12 ships and kill more than 250 on these ships and on shore. Though we've covered the storm as a whole, we really haven't touched the ships affected by it. Today, that's going to change. Let's look at SS Isaac M. Scott. She was launched from the American Shipbuilding Company's yards in Lorain, Ohio on June 12, 1909 as yard number 369 and was the pride of the Virginia Steamship Company's fleet. The Toledo Blade called her, quote, one of the handsomest of the large freighters on the Great Lakes. She would be completed on July 2, 1909, and her maiden voyage would take place 10 days later. However, it would not go smoothly. After completion and sea trials, the Scott set out on her maiden voyage from Cleveland, Ohio on July 12, 1909. The next day, she'd locked down in the Sioux Locks and had just entered Lake Superior in a dense, heavy fog when she collided with the downbound John B. Cowell at full speed near Whitefish Point. One witness who'd heard the collision described it as sounding as, quote, at first a rumble like distant thunder, then a distant groan, like tortured steel, accompanied by a series of deep-throated whistle blows and shouts through the distance, followed by, quote, an earthquake-like rumbling. A hollow silence followed, then more shouts and screams from men in the water. The Cowell was nearly split in two, and she sank in just 3 short minutes, leaving little chance for escape. It took another 45 minutes for the Scott to loosen her lifeboats and launch a rescue effort. 14 of the 24 crew aboard the Cowell were lost in the disaster. The Scott required a $30,000 overhaul, which would cost $1,068,000 in 2025, and replacement of 25 of her iron plates. It spelled a terrible end for the Cowell, and a horrible start for the Scott. In March of 1910, the Virginia Steamship Company settled claims filed by relatives of men lost in the sinking of John B. Cowell in the amount of $20,000. Pending an investigation and hearings, the U.S. steamboat inspectors at Marquette suspended Captain Rogers of John B. Cowell, as well as its pilot Edward E. Carleton, for 30 days. They further ruled that both ships had been sailing too fast for the weather conditions, and that the Cowell had failed to signal properly. F.W. Wertheimer, who had been piloting Isaac M. Scott that day, was subsequently beached for 1 year. Despite the fact that Captain MacArthur of the Scott had contributed to the Scott getting in this collision, he remained at her helm, and he would be there right up until the end. If you like my content and want more cool stuff to watch, please check out our new channel, Aviation Disasters Explained. The first videos go up for that channel on November 29th. Alright folks, let's look at the White Hurricane and the loss of the Scott. On the night of Thursday, November 6, 1913, the Scott sailed from Cleveland, stopping in Ashtabula, to take on a load of coal destined for Duluth, Minnesota. Despite clearly posted U.S. Weather Bureau hurricane warnings, Captain MacArthur and 27 other crewmen aboard the Scott headed out of the St. Clair River and into Lake Huron. At this time, Captain MacArthur, like many other captains on the Great Lakes, was not deterred by poor weather, and he set out onto the lake. Ahead of him was the John A. McGean, also set to be a victim in this storm. At about 3:30 p.m. on Sunday, November 9, 1913, Captain A.C. May of the H.B. Hawgood reported seeing the Scott enter Lake Huron. Captain May was heading southbound, and he, quote, thought the captain was a fool to leave the river. For context, Captain May saved the Hawgood by beaching her near Sarnia's Lake Huron Hotel. Captain May's sighting of the Scott was the last sighting of her afloat. The McGean and the Scott both wisely hugged Michigan's eastern shore to protect them from cyclonic northwest winds. Struggling against high winds, heavy seas, and blinding snow, every one of the Scott's crew would have worked frantically to stoke the engines, man the pumps, and steer the ship on her northerly course, hoping to sail through to the other side of the storm. Bad November storms were commonplace. How were they to know this one would be a record breaker? What Captain MacArthur could not anticipate, regardless of his skill as a mariner, was the gale's sudden shift in direction from northwest to northeast. The unexpected wind shift meant that waves buffeted the ship from one direction while the winds blasted her from the other side. She was tossed about in Lake Huron like a rubber duck in a tub, and the crew fought for their lives. They still had one chance to save themselves. But would they take it? Thank you so much to our amazing YouTube members and patrons. If you'd like to have some awesome perks like episodes a full day in advance, join our YouTube memberships today. Okay, let's get into the fate of SS Isaac M. Scott. Captain MacArthur had one last chance to save himself, his crew, and their vessel. He could have turned the ship into the relative safety of Saginaw Bay, where he could have then headed to the western shore of the Michigan Thumb and rode the storm out at anchor. This would have been wise, but this sort of caution was unlike Captain MacArthur, and so he ordered the boat turned back out into the open lake. Just a few more hours, and they would have made it to the Sioux Canal at Sault Ste. Marie and given his exhausted crew a rest. Tragically, this decision doomed the Scott and her crew. As every man aboard surely worked furiously at their station to save the struggling boat, a grim moment of horror must have washed over them as the boat lurched dangerously to her port side. Giant waves crashed over her and smashed in her skylights over the engine room, and water poured into the hatches. She was now in danger of sinking as water sloshed back and forth within the holds, enacting the free surface effect. She then listed further and further, then listing so far she could no longer correct herself, and she capsized. As soon as she keeled over and began to sink, every man on the boat except one was trapped. This one man would sadly be Captain MacArthur, whose body was recovered on December 11, 1913 at Southampton, Ontario, still wearing his life preserver. From what we can tell, no abandoned ship order seems to have been given. To me, this means the capsizing was sudden, and it would have been futile to launch lifeboats in such rough seas anyhow. Hypothermia would have killed anyone left in the water, and freezing gales would have contributed to this. A battered lifeboat with the boat's name washed ashore on the Canadian shore, and it was the only wreckage signaling the Scots' demise. No bodies except Captain MacArthur's were found, and it appears every man likely died at his station. Rest in peace to the 28 men lost aboard the Isaac M. Scott. In 1976, diver Kent Bellrichard found the wreck of the Scott about 6 miles north of Thunder Bay Island, Michigan. She lies upside down at a depth of 200 feet, and the Isaac M. Scott had taken 28 men to the bottom of what mariners nicknamed, quote, the Port of Missing Men, making this area their final resting place. 12 boats in total would sink, with 40 others being damaged or stranded during the White Hurricane of 1913. The White Hurricane was utterly disastrous for the region, and it would take months to fully recover from. Lake Huron was the deadliest area to be, with 178 of 235 mariners lost during the storm dying on Lake Huron. If you want to hear more about the White Hurricane, check out our video on it.